The United States President Joe Biden has hailed President Muhammadu Buhari for his efforts in deepening democracy, not only in Nigeria but also in Africa. The U.S. President spoke in Washington, D.C. while meeting with leaders of 6 African countries built to have elections in 2023 on the sidelines of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit taking place in the U.S. capital, Washington. According to a statement issued by the presidential spokesperson, Malam Garba Shehu, Biden says it is very heartening that Nigeria is quite a model for democracy, especially the fact that President Buhari is not seeking a third term. President Biden said the meeting with the select African leaders, including those of Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Liberia, Madagascar, and Sierra Leone, was to discuss elections and democracy in Africa, share experiences with the United States on the forthcoming elections, as well as encourage the countries to continue with the democratic process. Biden is also expected to back the African Union's admission as a permanent member of the Group of 20, otherwise known as G20, of course, countries with major economies.
Yeah. At the heart of the deep and profound connection that forever binds Africa and the United States together. We remember the stolen men and women and children who were brought to our shores in chains, subjected to unimaginable cruelty. My nation's original sin was that period. We honor their descendants who for generations have helped build this country and propel it to higher heights, leading the charge, blazing new trails, and forging a better future for everyone in America. Raising your glass to the people of America, to the people of the United States, to the people of Africa, and to the promise and potential of our partnership. Hear, hear.
We share the same spirit. We want to advance our common agenda with you and take our partnership to the next level in an inclusive approach, bringing together governments, the private sector, civil society, and the African diaspora.
Our people lie at the heart of the deep and profound connection.
And for more on this, we can now speak with the Rise correspondent Adesuwa Omoruan, who joins us now live from Washington. Hello, Adesuwa. Very good ululation there, as we say in literature, for Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari, coming from the U.S. President, about President Buhari deepening the cause of democracy, not only in Nigeria, but in Africa.
Indeed, thank you so much, Christian and Ngozi. Great to be on Newsnight tonight. Yes, that meeting held with 6 presidents, including Nigeria's Muhammadu Buhari, because they are having scheduled elections next year on the continent. Now, the meeting was to discuss how to foster democracy on the continent. We do know that, Christian, like we discussed yesterday, democracy has been on the decline. Several reports released last year and even in the early parts of this year do show that democracy in many countries around the world is on the decline. Autocratic rule, has been on the rise. President Joe Biden understands all that all too well, with President Donald Trump trying to overturn the election results even here in the U.S. and, of course, the infamous Capitol riots of January 6th. And so he said, Nigeria particularly has been a shining light because when he was vice president under President Barack Obama, President Muhammadu Buhari was trying to get into power. And the reason he's singling out Nigeria is because of the consistent, peaceful transition of power. And he applauded Nigeria for that. Now, particularly for President Muhammadu Buhari, he applauded him because we've seen off-season elections in the country, in Anambra State, in Osun State, and Ekiti State in the southwest, Anambra in the southeast, and how, even the candidates of the governing party, which President Buhari belongs to, lost that election, but he has embraced hosted. He has congratulated the winners and he welcomed them. And he has been reiterating the importance of bequeathing a transparent, free and credible elections to Nigeria.
It was so good to see you on the other side in Washington. Now, the U.S. is all in on Africa's future, and that's according to President Joe Biden. Help us unpack what he means and what kind of support is being offered not only to Nigeria but to the rest of Africa, both on democracy and, of course, the economy as a whole.
Ngozi, great to see you. I do miss you. President Biden moments ago, and let me just update you to say that the leaders from the continent and President Biden, as well as members of his cabinet, are currently in a closed-door session. They are discussing the 2063 agenda for Africa, the Africa we want. And a lot was said at the opening session by President Biden, who has expanded what he said yesterday, the quotes which you started with. America is all in on Africa. He expanded it to say we are also all in with Africa. This demonstrates, Ngozi, a shift from the past, from what we've seen in the last administration before President Biden. President Donald Trump never came to Africa. May I say President Biden has also announced an African trip, although he did not put a date to it. So the language we are seeing is different. On the surface, a lot of people say it's still rhetoric, but the language is different. Africa is seen as a partner. Today, he has also announced several initiatives on democracy, on security. If I could just get those figures in particular. Now, for security, he announced a $100 million initiative. The U.S. Defense Department is to work with its African counterpart in building capacity in that regard. Now, he touched on good governance, Ngozi. He said, of course, encountering what he says is democratic backsliding on the continent. He announced an initiative with the funding of $75 million. He's going to work with of course, the National Assembly here, the Senate, and of course the House in America here. Some people may be skeptical about that, considering that at the just concluded midterm elections, the U.S. did lose the House. So that might be difficult, but President Biden is optimistic that he will work with legislators to get that funding. Now, what this $75 million is supposed to do is to create a facility. What will this facility do? It will help to support African government in constitutional reforms, and particularly, this is interesting, Ngozi, when I heard it, he said it's also helped to facilitate voter registration. That is something all too familiar in Nigeria. We have seen how that has been a problem, a challenge for people to get registered, which is the fundamental process to an electoral process. President Biden also talked about the war in the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and of course how that has disrupted supply chains, food systems, and how it affects Africa. Another funding was announced for that. So when the U.S. says it's all in, nothing is being left out. Yesterday, it was like an auction house. The figures just kept coming on and on for farmers, smallholder farmers, for women, the youth. What we have seen at the summit and what sets it apart from other summits we have seen, again, let me remind you that these are still in all rhetoric because people will say, until there is implementation, until there is a follow-up, it still remains rhetoric. But we have seen that there's a difference, Ngozi. When it comes to the Africa-US summit that is currently ongoing, everybody has something. There's the core value of governance, democracy, which is something we don't see with China. China, yes, has heavy investment in infrastructure on the continent, but they don't care really about who is in power. They just do business. When it comes to the US, they are particular about who is in power, how do they get in power, is there freedom of speech, is there the rule of law, is it inclusive, are the women on the table, are the men there, are the young people there, are the, physically challenged people there. We have also seen the summit kicking off with the young diaspora African leaders. So connecting diaspora Africa back to their roots and how they can help meet the challenges of this time. That is also different from what we have seen in the China summit. However, the US tries not to compare, but we cannot but compare. Ngozi.
Adesuwa, before we let you go, I'm sure Christian has something to say. But you mentioned China there, and some analysts are saying, look, all of this really is, the U.S. trying to reassert its influence on the African continent. How mutually beneficial really will all of this be at the end of the day? And you mentioned earlier, I mean, there was AGOA and a whole other, promises from, there was Prosper Africa, there was AGOA, Power Africa, and all of that. How much of it really is, altruistic in terms of the benefits to Africa and especially Nigeria?
Thank you very much, Ngozi. So, yes, and these are the conversations that are being heard here. There are skeptics who say the U.S. is playing the catch-up game, but President Biden has for the second day reiterated the foundational flagship programs the U.S. has had and is building upon with this summit in Africa. It doesn't seem to want to claim to be playing the catch-up game with some of those programs you have mentioned. For instance, in Nigeria, Ngozi, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. remains, I don't have those figures at the moment, but I don't know for a fact that the U.S. was the largest donor of the life-saving COVID-19 vaccines. And we've had, of course, the program under former President George Bush, HIV, malaria, Power Africa, President Barack Obama, and Foster Africa, Prosper Africa as well, under President Clinton. So it is saying we're not playing the catch-up game. We just want to modernize the kind of relationship that we have with the continent. Now, what is Africa walking away with? What is Nigeria walking away with? The U.S. seems to be putting its money where its mouth is with all the initiatives and investments that have been announced, including a $55 billion. And, that was something that came up before this session went into a closed door, Ngozi. The agenda of Africa, the 2030 agenda of Africa, is what Africa should be talking about, not what the U.S. wants to do for the continent. So even though the U.S. says we are all in with you, we are all in on Africa, it is not about the U.S., but what Africa wants. What that $55 billion is going into, Ngozi, nobody can tell at the moment. And that's why critics and skeptics are saying it's still the same strategy. It's doing the same things all over again and expecting a different result. But it may be too early to say, but we have seen a lot of monies come out from the summit so far, Ngozi. What Africa is coming out with, time will tell.
Time indeed will tell. Yeah, thank you so very much for that elaborate analysis and, the happenings at the Africa U.S. Summit in Washington, D.C. Adesuwa Omoruan, a Rice correspondent there.